The airport buzzed with its usual mid-morning energy. Rolling suitcases, hurried goodbyes, the occasional wail of a tired toddler, and the low hum of overhead announcements echoing through the terminal. Amara tugged at the strap of her small backpack, her fingers brushing against the smooth edge of her window seat boarding pass. She'd checked it 3 times already. Seat 23A, window, just how she liked it. Flying made her stomach flutter, not in a fun way, but in that nervous, twisting kind of way that made her want to hold someone's hand the whole time. She was 10, old enough to pretend she wasn't scared, but young enough that the fear still showed in the way she bit her lip when the plane taxied, or how she kept her eyes squeezed shut during takeoff. This trip was special, though. She wasn't flying alone. Her grandmother was right beside her, calm as ever, with her soft gray curls tucked under a wide-brimmed hat and a well-worn leather tote slung over her shoulder, like it held the whole world. They'd been up since dawn, catching the early shuttle from their neighborhood to the airport. Amara had barely slept the night before, too excited and too nervous all at once. Her grandmother had stayed up with her, making hot cocoa and telling stories about her own first flight, how she'd thought the clouds were made of cotton candy and had tried to open the window to grab some. Amara had laughed, the kind of laugh that loosens knots in your chest, and for a little while the fear had quieted. Now, standing in the boarding line, Amara watched people file onto the plane ahead of them. Business travelers with crisp shirts and tired eyes, families with kids bouncing on their toes, a couple holding hands like they were heading somewhere magical. She took a deep breath and stepped forward when their group was called. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of cleaning spray and coffee. The overhead bins were already half full, and the low murmur of voices filled the narrow aisle. Amara followed her grandmother to row 23, sliding into the window seat with a quiet sigh of relief. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass for just a second, watching the tarmac below, ground crews moving like ants, luggage carts weaving between planes. Up here, everything felt orderly, predictable, safe. Her grandmother settled into the aisle seat with a soft groan, stretching her legs as much as the cramped space allowed. "You okay, baby?" she asked, her voice low and warm. Amara nodded. "Yeah, just hoping we don't hit any bumps. You'll be fine," her grandmother said, reaching over to squeeze her knee. "And if we do, I'll hold your hand the whole time." Amara smiled. That was enough. For the next 20 minutes, passengers continued to board. The cabin filled steadily, the hum growing louder as people stowed bags, argued over armrests, and settled into their seats. Amara kept her eyes on the window, tracing invisible shapes in the condensation that had started to form. She didn't notice the man until he was standing right beside her row. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive, with a leather briefcase in one hand and a boarding pass in the other. He glanced at the seat numbers, then at Amara, then at her grandmother. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm in 23A, I believe that's my seat." Amara blinked. She looked down at her own pass, then back up at him. "No, I'm in 23A, see?" She held it out. He frowned slightly, pulling out his own pass. "That's odd. I have 23A as well." A flight attendant passing by paused. "Everything all right here?" The man handed her his boarding pass. She glanced at it, then at Amara's grandmother, who had already pulled out her own and Amara's. The attendant's brow furrowed. That's strange. Let me check the system." She stepped away for a moment, speaking quietly into her headset. When she returned, her expression had softened. "There's been a double booking error," she explained. "We've got 2 passengers assigned to 23A, I'm so sorry." Amara's stomach dropped. She clutched the armrest. The attendant turned to the man. "Sir, we can move you to 25C. It's also a window seat, just a couple rows back." He shook his head. "I'm traveling with my colleague. We specifically booked adjacent seats. If I move back, we'll be separated." The attendant nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Let me see what I can do." She turned to Amara and her grandmother. "Ma'am, would you and your daughter be willing to switch to 26B and 26C? They're middle and aisle, but they're together and it would solve the issue." Amara's grandmother didn't answer right away. She looked at Amara, who was now staring at her lap, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Flying was hard enough without being shoved into a middle seat, boxed in on both sides with no view and no escape. "I'd rather not." her grandmother said gently but firmly. My granddaughter has anxiety about flying. She needs the window. We booked this seat for a reason. The flight attendant hesitated. I completely understand. But we're trying to accommodate everyone. Before she could finish, the man spoke again. Look, I don't mean to be difficult, but this is a work trip. My colleague and I need to go over some materials before our meeting. It's not ideal to be separated. His voice wasn't unkind, but there was an edge to it, an expectation that his needs mattered more. Amara felt it like a weight pressing down. She wanted to disappear. Her grandmother straightened in her seat. And my granddaughter needs to feel safe. That matters too. The cabin seemed to go quiet for a beat, even though the noise hadn't changed. A few nearby passengers glanced over. The flight attendant looked caught between protocol and empathy. Let me check with the purser, she said finally, and walked away. The man lingered for a moment, then sighed and stepped into the aisle, waiting. Amara kept her eyes on the window, but she could feel his presence like a shadow. Her heart pounded. She hated this. Hated being the reason for tension, hated feeling small and powerless. Her grandmother reached over and took her hand. You don't have to move, she whispered. Not if you don't want to. But what if they make us? Amara whispered back. They won't, her grandmother said. Not if I have anything to say about it. A few minutes later, a different flight attendant approached, older with silver streaks in her hair and a calm, steady presence. She introduced herself as the lead crew member and listened carefully as the first attendant explained the situation. Then she knelt beside Amara's seat, bringing herself down to eye level. Her voice was soft, almost maternal. Hi there. I'm Lisa, what's your name? Amara hesitated, then mumbled. Amara. Lisa repeated like she was tasting the name. That's a beautiful name. Can I ask your last name, sweetheart? Just so I can double-check our records? Amara glanced at her grandmother, who gave a small nod. Justice, she said quietly. Amara Justice. The moment the name left her lips, something shifted. Lisa's eyes widened, just slightly but enough that Amara noticed. The other flight attendant froze mid-sentence. Even the man in the suit seemed to sense the change in the air and took a half-step back. Lisa stood slowly, her expression unreadable but deeply thoughtful. She turned to her colleague and murmured something too low for Amara to hear. Then she spoke into her headset, her voice urgent but controlled. Within seconds, 2 more crew members appeared, one from the front galley, another from the rear. They exchanged quick words with Lisa, glancing toward Amara and her grandmother with something that looked like reverence. The man in the suit cleared his throat. So, what's happening with the seat? Without looking at him, Lisa said, We've found you another seat, sir. Right up front in 5D. Plenty of legroom and your colleague can join you in 5E. He opened his mouth to protest, but something in Lisa's tone stopped him. He nodded stiffly and followed the other attendant toward the front of the plane. No one explained anything to Amara. No one made a big deal. But as the crew walked away, Lisa paused and gave Amara a small, knowing smile, one that held layers of understanding Amara was too young to fully grasp. The cabin returned to its usual pre-flight bustle, but the tension had lifted. Amara exhaled for the first time in minutes. She looked at her grandmother, who was watching her with quiet pride. You okay? Her grandmother asked. Amara nodded, though she didn't understand why everything had changed so suddenly. All she knew was that she got to keep her window seat, and that for now was enough. Outside, the plane began to push back from the gate. The engines hummed to life, a deep, reassuring rumble that vibrated through the floor. Amara pressed her palm against the cool glass again and watched the terminal shrink behind them. She didn't know it yet, but her name, simple as it sounded, carried a story much bigger than this moment. And in the rows around her, a few passengers were already whispering it to each other, eyes wide with recognition. But Amara? She was just a girl who wanted to fly without fear, and for now that was exactly what she was going to do. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, its wheels groaning softly against the tarmac. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed just a touch, and the flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency down the aisles, double-checking seatbelts, stowing stray bags, and offering last-minute reassurances with warm smiles. But something was different now. The air felt lighter, calmer, like a storm had passed without ever breaking. Amara stayed quiet, her forehead still resting against the window. She watched the airport buildings shrink in the distance, her breath fogging the glass in little puffs. Her fingers tapped lightly on her knee, a nervous habit she couldn't quite shake. But the tightness in her chest, the one that usually came with takeoff, wasn't as sharp this time. Maybe it was because her grandmother's hand still rested gently on hers, or maybe it was because no one had made her move. Whatever it was, she felt steadier. A few rows ahead, the man in the dark suit sat stiffly in his new seat near the front. He hadn't looked back once. His colleague whispered something to him, and he gave a short nod, but his jaw stayed clenched. He kept glancing toward the back of the plane as if trying to figure out what had just happened. Nearby passengers who'd overheard the earlier exchange were doing the same. A woman in 22C leaned slightly toward her seatmate and murmured, "Did you catch that name? Justice?" Her friend frowned, then her eyes widened. No, it couldn't be. But she pulled out her phone anyway, fingers flying across the screen. Back in row 23, the lead flight attendant, Lisa, returned. This time she didn't hover or speak to the grandmother first. She knelt again beside Amara, her voice low and steady like she was sharing a secret. "Amara," she said, "thank you for your patience. You're all set in your seat. No one's going to ask you to move again?" Amara looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Really," Lisa said, and this time her smile reached her eyes. "You just relax, okay? We've got you." She stood, but before walking away she paused and gave Amara's grandmother a long, quiet look, one that held more than just professional courtesy. It was respect, maybe even gratitude. As Lisa moved back up the aisle, another flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Darnell, brought over a small cup of water and a soft fleece blanket, even though no one had asked for either. He handed them to Amara with a gentle nod. "For the flight," he said simply. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Your grandma's a legend." Amara blinked. "What?" He just smiled and walked away. Her grandmother chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, honey," she said, "I think they figured it out." "Figured what out?" Amara asked, confused. Her grandmother didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was old, edges curled, colors faded, but the image was clear. A younger version of her grandmother standing on an airport tarmac, surrounded by reporters, holding a legal folder like a shield. Behind her, a plane sat idle on the runway, its door open like a silent witness. "That was 22 years ago," her grandmother said, her voice quiet but strong. "I was supposed to fly to a conference in Chicago. Same airline, different plane. I had my seat window just like yours. But when I got on board, a crew member told me there'd been a mistake. They said I'd been accidentally assigned a first-class seat and needed to move to the back." Amara's eyes widened. "But you had a ticket?" "I did, paid for it myself. But they didn't care. They said I didn't belong up front. When I refused to move, they called security. Dragged me off the plane in front of everyone. Cameras everywhere. Humiliation on loop." Amara's stomach twisted. "That's awful." "It was," her grandmother said. "But it wasn't just about me. After that, people started talking. Really talking. Other travelers came forward with their own stories. Black families moved without cause, Latino passengers questioned more than others, elders treated like they were in the way. It wasn't isolated. It was a pattern." She tapped the photo. "So I sued. Not just for me. For everyone who'd been made to feel small just because of how they looked. The case went all the way to a federal review. And because of it, this airline and others had to change their policies. Training, oversight, accountability. They even created a passenger dignity clause." Amara stared at the photo, then at her grandmother. "So, that's why they knew your name?" "Not mine," her grandmother corrected gently. "Yours because you carry it. Justice isn't just a last name, baby. It's a promise. And sometimes just saying it out loud is enough to remind people what's right." Amara sat back, letting that sink in. She'd heard pieces of the story before. Bedtime tales wrapped in courage, but never like this. Never with the weight of real consequence. She looked around the cabin. The flight attendants moved with extra care near their row. A woman in 24A turned and gave her a small, respectful nod. Even the overhead lights seemed to glow a little warmer. Up in first class, the man who'd asked her to move shifted in his seat. He'd overheard enough from the crew's hushed conversations to piece things together. One attendant had whispered, "Do you know who that is?" to another, and the answer had traveled like a ripple. Now he kept his eyes forward, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter. Maybe shame, maybe just surprise. The plane lifted off the ground with a smooth surge, and Amara gripped the armrests instinctively. But this time she didn't close her eyes. She watched as the earth fell away, rooftops turning into toys, roads into thin gray threads. The fear was still there, but it didn't own her. Not today. Her grandmother squeezed her hand. "You did good back there," she said. "You didn't yell. You didn't cry. You just stood your ground by staying still. That takes strength," Amara swallowed. "I didn't even say much." "You didn't have to," her grandmother replied. "Sometimes just being who you are is enough." As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, reassuring, giving the usual updates about weather and estimated arrival time. But then, after a slight pause, he added something unusual. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We're honored to have every single one of you on board, and especially grateful for those who remind us in quiet ways of the values we strive to uphold." A few passengers exchanged glances. Some smiled. Others looked toward the back of the plane. In the galley, Lisa and Darnell prepared drink carts, but their conversation was hushed, serious. "I read about her case in training," Darnell said. "They show it in the bias module. The justice incident. It's why we have the new de-escalation protocols." Lisa nodded. And now her granddaughter's sitting in 23A, just wanting to fly like anyone else. No fanfare, no demands, just dignity. "She didn't even know they'd recognize the name," Darnell said, shaking his head. "She was just being a kid." "Exactly," Lisa said. "And that's what got to me. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She just wanted her seat, and that's the point, isn't it? That she shouldn't have to fight for something that's already hers." Back in their seats, Amara finally unwrapped the blanket Darnell had given her. It was soft, navy blue with the airline's logo stitched in the corner. She draped it over her lap, feeling its warmth seep into her legs. Her grandmother dozed lightly beside her, head tilted against the headrest, her breathing slow and even. Amara pulled out a notebook from her backpack, the one with the galaxy cover she'd picked out at the school supply store. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Today I kept my seat," and my name meant something. She didn't know it yet, but someone a few rows back had already snapped a blurry, respectful photo, just the back of her seat. The blanket, her small hand resting on the armrest. No face, no identifying details. Just a quiet moment. Later, they'd posted online with a caption, "Sometimes history isn't loud. Sometimes it's a 10-year-old girl who just wants to look out the window." The flight stretched on, smooth and steady. Meals were served. Movies played on tiny screens. Clouds drifted past like slow-motion waves. And Amara, for the first time, didn't feel like she was holding her breath. She wasn't thinking about legacy or lawsuits or airline policies. She was just a kid on a plane, watching the world from above, safe in her window seat. But somewhere in the hum of the engines and the rustle of pages turning, something bigger was happening. A quiet acknowledgement that respect isn't earned through noise, but through presence. Through simply showing up and refusing to be erased. And as the sun dipped low outside, casting golden light across the wing, Amara leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Not from fear, but from peace. She didn't need to understand the full weight of her name to carry it well. She just needed to be herself, and that, it turned out, was more than enough. The hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, like a lullaby for the sky. Amara had drifted in and out of sleep, her head resting against the window, the cool glass pressing gently against her temple. She dreamed of clouds shaped like animals, elephants, dragons, even a turtle floating lazily through the blue. But every so often she'd stir awake, blinking at the cabin lights, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional clink of a coffee cup. Each time she'd glance at her grandmother, still dozing peacefully beside her, and feel that quiet sense of safety return. But while Amara rested, the story of her name had already begun to move through the plane like a whisper on the wind. In row 18, a college student named Priya scrolled through her phone, her fingers pausing on an old news article titled, "Airline Settles Landmark Discrimination Case After Passenger Removed Without Cause." The photo showed a woman standing tall in a courthouse doorway, her expression calm but unyielding. Priya's eyes flicked up toward the back of the cabin, She hadn't heard the full exchange earlier, but she'd caught the name. Justice. And something in her gut told her it wasn't a coincidence. 2 rows behind, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Ellis sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the seat back in front of him. He remembered that case. He'd clipped the newspaper article and kept it in his desk for years, using it in classroom discussions about fairness and standing up for what's right. He'd even written a letter to the airline back then, though he never sent it. Now knowing that the woman's granddaughter was on this very flight, just a child wanting nothing more than to sit by the window, filled him with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that the fight had mattered. Sorrow that it had ever been necessary. Up in first class, the man who'd asked Amara to move sat stiffly, staring at his untouched meal. His colleague had tried to make small talk, but he'd barely responded. He wasn't angry anymore. He was unsettled, because now he understood it wasn't just a name. It was a legacy, one built on being told no when the answer should have been yes, on being treated like a problem instead of a person. And he'd nearly repeated that same mistake, not out of malice, but out of habit, the kind of thoughtless assumption that someone else's comfort mattered less than his own. He glanced toward the back again, but not with annoyance this time, with something closer to regret. Meanwhile, in the galley, Lisa and Darnell prepared for the drink service, but their minds were elsewhere. "You think she knows how much her grandmother changed things?" Darnell asked quietly, stacking cups with care. Lisa shook her head. "Probably not the full picture. But she doesn't need to. She's living it." "She didn't even mention the name at first," Darnell said. "She just said she didn't want to move. That's what got me. She wasn't waving a flag. She was just being honest." "That's the thing about dignity," Lisa replied. "It doesn't announce itself. It just is." Back in row 23, Amara finally sat up straight, rubbing her eyes. The sun had shifted, painting the cabin in warm afternoon light. Her grandmother stirred beside her, stretching slightly. "Feel better?" her grandmother asked, voice still soft with sleep. Amara nodded. "Yeah, I think I actually slept." "Good. Flying's easier when you're not fighting it." Amara looked down at her lap, twisting the edge of the blanket. "Grandma, why didn't you tell me people would know your name?" Her grandmother smiled. "Because I didn't want you to carry it like a burden. It's yours, but it's not something you have to perform. You don't owe anyone a speech or a lesson just because of who your family is." "But they treated me differently after they heard it," Amara said, frowning slightly. "Was that okay?" Her grandmother thought for a moment. "It depends. If they'd treated you like a celebrity, that wouldn't be right. But if they treated you with respect, not because of fame, but because they remembered what your name stands for, that's different. That's them choosing to do better." Amara nodded slowly. She still didn't fully understand, but she trusted her grandmother's words like she trusted the ground beneath her feet, even when she couldn't see it. Later, as the flight attendants began serving snacks, Darnell stopped by their row again. This time he handed Amara a small packet of cookies and a juice box, nothing special, the same as everyone else was getting. But he also slipped a folded piece of paper onto her tray table when her grandmother wasn't looking. When he walked away, Amara opened it. In neat handwriting it read, "Thank you for carrying her name. It still means something up here." She tucked the note into her notebook next to her earlier sentence. Now it read, "Today I kept my seat. And my name meant something. Someone thanked me for it." She didn't show it to her grandmother. Not because she was hiding it, but because it felt private, like a secret handshake between strangers who understood the same truth. As the flight continued, more small moments unfolded. A flight attendant refilled her water without being asked. The passenger in 24B offered her a pack of gum with a kind smile. No one stared. No one made a scene. But there was a quiet awareness, like the whole cabin had taken a breath and decided to be gentler. Later, during a lull in the service, Lisa sat down in the jump seat near the rear galley and pulled out her phone. She typed a quick message to her sister, who worked in airline compliance. "You'll never guess who's on my flight today. Amara Justice. Yes, that Justice. She's 10. She just wanted her window seat. And she got it." Her sister replied instantly, "Tell her thank you. From all of us who remember." Lisa smiled and put her phone away. Back in their seats, Amara's grandmother reached into her tote and pulled out a small, cloth-bound book. "Want to hear a story?" she asked. Amara perked up. Is it about you? Not exactly, her grandmother said. It's about a girl who boarded a bus in Montgomery long before I was born. She wasn't trying to start a movement. She was just tired. And she said no, that's all. Just no. But that one word changed everything. Amara listened, eyes wide, as her grandmother wove the tale of quiet courage, of ordinary people doing ordinary things that turned out to be extraordinary. She spoke of lunch counters and school doors and courtrooms, but always came back to the same idea, that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a child refusing to give up her seat. Sometimes it's a grandmother who sues an airline not for money but for principle. Sometimes it's a flight crew who chooses to remember. People think heroes wear capes, her grandmother said softly, but most of the time they just wear their truth. Amara looked out the window again. The sky was endless, dotted with clouds that glowed gold in the late sun. She thought about how small she felt up here and yet how connected. To her grandmother. To the past. To the people on this plane who had chosen, in their own small ways, to honor something bigger than themselves. She didn't feel famous. She didn't feel special. She just felt seen, and that was rare enough to be precious. As the plane began its slow descent toward the destination city, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, calm and steady. We're beginning our approach. Please return your seats to the upright position. Amara sat up straight, buckling her seatbelt with care. The fear was there. Takeoffs and landings always made her pulse quicken. But it was softer now, wrapped in something stronger. Her grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand. You did good today, she said again. Amara smiled. I didn't do anything. You stayed, her grandmother said. And sometimes staying is the bravest thing you can do. Outside, the city lights began to appear, tiny pinpricks of gold spreading across the darkening earth. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, and the plane rolled smoothly toward the terminal. As they taxied to the gate, Amara gathered her things. The notebook, the blanket folded neatly, the juice box still half full. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she stepped off this plane, her story would begin to spread. Not as gossip, but as a reminder. A quiet testament to the fact that dignity doesn't need a spotlight to exist. It just needs space to breathe. And today, on this ordinary flight, a 10-year-old girl had claimed that space simply by saying, "This is my seat." No fanfare, no anger. Just truth. And sometimes that's enough to shift the world, one window seat at a time. The plane rolled to a gentle stop at the gate, its engines winding down like a long exhale. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flickered off with a soft chime, and the cabin stirred to life. Seatbacks clicked upright, tray tables folded away, and the low murmur of voices returned as passengers stretched and gathered their things. But in row 23, Amara stayed still for a moment longer, her fingers resting on the armrests, her eyes fixed on the window where the jet bridge slowly crept toward the door. She wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in a long time, flying hadn't left her feeling drained or anxious. It had left her feeling seen. Not as a problem to be moved, not as a child to be managed, but as someone who belonged exactly where she was. Her grandmother stood slowly, stretching her arms above her head with a quiet groan. Ready to go, baby? Amara nodded and stood, slipping her backpack on and folding the soft navy blanket one last time before handing it back to Darnell as he passed by. Keep it, he said with a small smile. It's yours. She hesitated, then tucked it into her bag. Thank you. He nodded but didn't say more. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in glances, gestures, and quiet choices. As they made their way down the aisle, passengers didn't stare or whisper, not openly anyway. But Amara felt their awareness like a gentle current. A woman in 20A gave her a warm nod. An older man near the exit touched his hand to his heart in a silent gesture she didn't fully understand, but somehow felt in her chest. Even the man from first class, now waiting near the front with his briefcase, kept his eyes down as they passed, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, maybe humility, maybe just the weight of having been reminded that not every request is fair, even when it's polite. Outside the plane, the terminal buzzed with its usual chaos, families reuniting, travelers rushing to connections, announcements echoing from every direction. But Amara walked beside her grandmother with a new kind of calm, her steps steady, her shoulders relaxed. They hadn't gone far when a young woman with a camera slung around her neck approached them near the baggage claim area. She looked nervous, holding her phone in one hand like she wasn't sure whether to speak or not. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I was on your flight. I just wanted to say thank you." Amara blinked. "For what?" The woman glanced around, lowering her voice. "For not moving. For just being you. I saw what happened, and I recorded a little of it. Not your face, I promise. But just the moment when the crew heard your name and everything changed. I posted it online, and people are already sharing it. Not in a weird way. In a good way, like a reminder." Amara looked at her grandmother, unsure. Her grandmother gave a small nod. "As long as no one's being exploited or misrepresented, it's okay," she said gently. "Sometimes stories need to be told," the woman smiled. "I didn't show your face. Just the back of the seat, the blanket, your hand on the armrest. And I wrote, sometimes history isn't loud. Sometimes it's a 10-year-old girl who just wants to look out the window. That's all." Amara didn't know what to say, so she just said, "Okay." The woman thanked them again and walked away, already typing on her phone. Later, as they waited for their luggage, Amara's grandmother pulled out her own phone. She didn't usually spend much time on social media, but curiosity got the better of her. She typed in a few words: airline, justice, window seat, and within seconds, a thread appeared. It wasn't viral in the flashy, noisy way some things go viral. There were no dramatic headlines or clickbait thumbnails, just a quiet post with a blurry photo and a short caption. But the comments told the real story. "My mom told me about the justice case when I was in high school. It's why I became a flight attendant, to make sure no one ever feels unwelcome in the sky. I was on that flight. I didn't know who she was at first, but I saw how the crew reacted. It gave me chills. This is why names matter. Not for fame, but for memory." She didn't ask for attention. She just asked to stay, and that's the point. Her grandmother scrolled slowly, her eyes softening with each line. She didn't show Amara the screen, not because it was secret, but because this wasn't Amara's burden to carry yet. Let her be 10 a little longer. Their suitcase finally tumbled onto the carousel, a bright red one with a chipped corner from years of travel. Amara grabbed the handle and they headed toward the exit. Outside, the evening air was cool and crisp, scented with rain and city life. A taxi waited at the curb, and as they climbed in, the driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" "The Grand Avenue Hotel," her grandmother said. The driver nodded, then paused. "Wait, justice?" "As in," her grandmother smiled faintly, "as in just a grandmother and her granddaughter catching a flight." The driver chuckled, but his eyes held respect. "Well, welcome back to the city, ma'am." "It's an honor." Amara looked out the window as the taxi pulled into traffic, watching streetlights blur past. She didn't understand why her name carried so much weight in strangers' eyes. To her, it was just her name, the one on her report cards, her library card, her bedroom door. But now she was starting to see that names aren't just labels. They're echoes. And hers echoed through courtrooms, policy manuals, and even airplane cabins. Back at the hotel, they checked in without fuss. The front desk clerk recognized her grandmother immediately but said nothing, just handed over the key card with an extra towel and a quiet, "We're glad you're here." Up in their room, Amara flopped onto one of the beds, kicking off her shoes. The day had been long but not exhausting. More like full. Like she'd lived a whole story in just a few hours. Her grandmother sat by the window looking out at the city skyline. "You know," she said after a while, "I never wanted you to feel like you had to live up to my name." Amara rolled onto her side. "I don't feel like I have to. I just like that it means something." Her grandmother turned, her eyes glistening. "That's the difference, baby. When you carry a name because you love what it stands for, not because you're afraid of failing it, that's when it becomes a gift, not a weight." Amara thought about that. She thought about the flight attendants who remembered, the passengers who nodded, the woman who posted the photo not for views but for truth. None of them expected her to be a hero. They just honored the fact that she'd been honest. Later that night, as she lay in bed with the hotel blanket pulled up to her chin, Amara opened her notebook again. She added a new line beneath the others. "People remembered. Not because I shouted, because I stayed." She didn't know it yet, but across the country, teachers were saving the post to show their students. Flight training programs were adding it to their discussion guides. Parents were telling their kids, "See, you don't have to be loud to matter." And in a small office at the airline's headquarters, a compliance officer printed the post and pinned it to the bulletin board beside the policy handbook. Underneath, she wrote in marker, "This is why we listen." But none of that reached Amara's ears that night. All she knew was the soft hum of the city outside, the sound of her grandmother's steady breathing from the other bed, and the quiet certainty that she'd done nothing wrong by wanting to stay in her seat. She hadn't demanded special treatment. She hadn't used her name as a weapon. She'd simply said, "This is mine," and trusted that it would be enough. And it had been. As sleep pulled her under, she dreamed again of clouds, but this time she wasn't watching them from behind glass. She was walking on them, light as air, with her grandmother beside her, both of them smiling, both of them exactly where they belonged, and somewhere high above the earth, another flight attendant knelt beside a nervous child and said, "It's okay. You're safe here," because someone had reminded them that kindness isn't just policy, it's legacy, and legacies, when tended with care, keep growing long after the moment has passed. The morning sun filtered through the hotel curtains, soft and golden, painting stripes across the carpet. Amara sat cross-legged on the bed, eating a piece of toast with strawberry jam, her notebook open on her lap. She wasn't writing anything new, just flipping through the pages, rereading her lines like they were clues to a puzzle she hadn't quite solved yet. Her grandmother was in the bathroom, humming an old gospel tune while brushing her hair. The sound was familiar, comforting, like coming home after a long trip, even though they were still away from home. Downstairs, the city was already wide awake. Delivery trucks rumbled past, street vendors set up their carts, and commuters hurried toward subway entrances with coffee in hand. But up in room 412, time moved slower, wrapped in the quiet afterglow of something meaningful. Amara didn't know it yet, but the short video from the flight had spread further than anyone expected. Not in a flashy, trending on every platform kind of way, but in the steady, thoughtful way that real stories travel, shared in teacher lounges, posted in community groups, whispered between colleagues over lunch breaks. It wasn't about drama. It was about dignity, and people were hungry for that. By mid-morning, a local news station reached out to the airline for comment. The airline didn't release names or details respecting privacy, but they did issue a brief statement. "We are committed to ensuring every passenger feels safe, respected, and valued. Moments like this remind us why that commitment matters," that was all. No grand press release, no staged apology, just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest moments carry the deepest lessons. Meanwhile, in a high school classroom 3 states away, a history teacher paused her lesson on civil rights and pulled up the post on the projector. "This," she told her students, "is how change keeps living. Not just in marches or laws, but in everyday choices." A child asked to stay in her seat. A crew remembers why fairness matters. And the world shifts just a little. The students were quiet. One girl raised her hand, but she didn't even know her name would mean something to them. "Exactly," the teacher said. And that's what makes it real. Back in the city, Amara and her grandmother stepped out of the hotel into the cool morning air. They weren't here for a conference or a court date or anything official. They were here for a family reunion. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and great-grandma Lillian, who still made the best peach cobbler in 3 counties. It was supposed to be a simple weekend. Just love, laughter, and too much food. But as they walked toward the subway station, a woman on the sidewalk stopped mid-step, squinting at Amara's grandmother. Then her eyes widened. "Wait, you're her, aren't you? The one from the airline case?" Her grandmother smiled gently. "I'm just a woman who believes in fair treatment." The woman stepped closer, voice hushed with awe. "My daughter's a flight attendant now. She told me your story during training. Said it changed how she sees her job." She turned to Amara. "And you must be—" "Amara," she said softly. The woman's eyes glistened. "Thank you both for reminding people that names carry stories." She didn't ask for a photo, didn't pull out her phone. She just nodded, touched her hand to her chest, and walked on. Amara looked up at her grandmother. "Does this happen a lot?" "Not like this," her grandmother admitted. "Usually it's quiet. A letter in the mail. A stranger saying thank you in an airport. But today feels different. Because today the story wasn't just about the past. It was about a 10-year-old girl who hadn't set out to make a statement. She just wanted to fly without fear. And in doing so, she'd become a living bridge between history and hope. Later that afternoon, at the family gathering, the house buzzed with noise. Kids running through the halls. Uncles arguing over football. The smell of collard greens and cornbread filling every room. Great-grandma Lillian sat in her favorite armchair, her hands folded over a crocheted blanket, watching everything with quiet joy. When Amara walked in, the room didn't go silent, but a few people paused. Her cousin Tasha, who was 16 and thought she knew everything, gave her a long look. "So, you're the one who made the airline crew freeze, huh?" Amara shrugged. "I didn't make them do anything. I just said my name." Tasha laughed. "Girl, you don't get it. That name? It's like a superpower." Amara didn't feel like a superhero. She felt like herself, tired from travel, hungry for cobbler, and a little overwhelmed by all the attention. But she also felt proud. Not because she'd done something extraordinary, but because she'd stayed true to what she needed, and that had been enough. After dinner, as the sun dipped low and fireflies blinked in the backyard, Amara sat on the porch steps with her grandmother. The noise of the house faded behind them, replaced by crickets and the distant hum of traffic. "You know," her grandmother said, "when I was your age, I never thought my name would mean anything to anyone but my mama." Amara looked at her. "But it does." "It does now," her grandmother said, "because I chose to stand up. And because you chose to sit down." Amara smiled. "I didn't even think about it. I just didn't want to move." "And that's the point," her grandmother said. "Justice isn't always a protest. Sometimes it's just refusing to be moved when you're already in the right place." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, a plane passed overhead, its lights blinking like a slow heartbeat. Later that night, back in their hotel room, Amara's grandmother finally checked her email. Among the usual messages, bills, newsletters, a note from her book club, was one from a retired flight attendant she hadn't heard from in years. It read, "Saw the post about your granddaughter. Made me cry. I was working the day you were removed from that flight. I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my place. But seeing her, calm, quiet, just wanting her seat, it reminded me that silence is a choice too. Thank you for raising her to be herself, and thank you for forgiving those of us who didn't do enough back then." Her grandmother read it twice. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, "Oh, child, you didn't just fly today. You healed something." Amara was already asleep, curled under the blanket from the flight, her notebook tucked under her pillow like a talisman. The next morning, they packed their bags and headed to the airport for the return flight. This time there was no seat confusion, no tense exchanges, just smooth check-in, friendly smiles, and a window seat waiting in row 23. Reserved specially, though no one said so out loud. As they boarded, the same lead flight attendant from the first flight, Lisa, was there. She didn't make a scene, didn't point or wave, but when she saw them, she gave a small, knowing nod. And when Amara settled into her seat, a fresh navy blanket was already folded on the tray table with a new note. "Safe travels. The sky's always yours." Amara smiled and tucked it into her bag. On the flight home, she didn't sleep. She watched the clouds, traced shapes in the condensation, and thought about how ordinary moments can become extraordinary when they're rooted in truth. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a symbol. She was just a girl who wanted to look out the window, and in that simple act, she'd reminded a whole cabin and then a whole community of what respect really looks like. Weeks later, the video still circulated, not as a viral clip but as a quiet reference point. A new training module at the airline included a blurred still from it, with the caption, "Dignity doesn't announce itself. Listen for it." And in a small office, an old woman watched a recording of the post on her tablet, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't say much. She just smiled, touched the screen gently, and whispered, "She didn't need my name to stand her ground. But it's good the world remembered why it matters." Outside, Amara walked through the terminal, hand in hand with her grandmother, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her notebook full of quiet truths. She didn't know she'd just become part of the next chapter in a family legacy. She just knew she'd had a good trip, and sometimes that's how history moves forward. not with fanfare, but with a child's hand in her grandmother's, walking calmly through the world, exactly where she belongs.